Good morning and welcome to the 21st meeting of the committee in 2019. I'd like to remind members and the public to turn off their mobile phones, and anyone using electronic devices to access committee papers should please ensure that they are turned to silent. We have received apologies this morning from Claire Baker MSP and Mike Rumbles MSP. The first item on our agenda is an evidence session on the committee's arts funding inquiry. And we are joined by Julia Armour, the Director of Festivals Edinburgh, Ken Hay from Culture Aberdeen, and Jennifer Hunter, the Executive Leader at Culture Counts. The purpose of this evidence session is to investigate some of the findings from comparative research commissioned by the committee from Drew Wiley to support its inquiry, particularly the findings relating to data collection, policy analysis, international benchmarking and collaboration, and we may also explore some of the other issues that have been raised in earlier evidence sessions. Can I first of all thank you for your written submissions, which have been very useful to the committee, and touch on all these areas and more. I guess looking at international comparisons and data collections, as we all know, the National Performance Framework has an outcome on culture, and the cultural strategy will support that. And a really important element of that is how you measure the contribution of culture. I think there's an increasing understanding of the important contribution that culture makes across all areas of policy making, but how do we measure that? And certainly some of the evidence that the committee has already taken around the country from artists and arts organisations, some of the feedback was that they felt that there was far too heavy a burden on them in order to prove the value of culture, and that someone else should be doing that. So I wondered if you had any thoughts that you could share with us on how the impact of arts funding should be measured and assessed. Should it be via individual funding applications on a sectoral basis or by some other means?
We've been looking into this recently, actually, so it's quite good timing. What we've realised is there's different measurements happening depending on where you are. So local authorities measure some things, national companies measure other things, regular funded organisations at Creative Scotland measure different things again. So it would be quite good for us to get to a position where that could be streamlined so that we could learn more for it in a kind of organised way and create data. Because at the moment, all the data we've got is quite messy, so it doesn't really add up to anything that we can use coherently. There is a system in Australia called Whitebox, which is a private enterprise. It's really interesting because what it does is it measures inputs into the cultural sector, at what the activity is, what the outputs are and what the outcomes are. That enables you to go into it and maybe say, you know, I've got a group of teenagers who I have to improve confidence with, and you can directly get access to some data that will tell you what the best activities therefore are to do. So they are starting to really get an understanding of how culture actually works, what works where, in a really useful way. And it keeps all of their data in one place. The only problem with it being a private enterprise is that they're only measuring the people who have signed up to pay for the software. So if you had an open source version, if the Scottish Government had an open source version of this kind of thing, it could lead them to being a kind of world leader in how culture works if they created it and then enabled everyone, all the different players, to sign up to that and feed back into it.
I really like that idea of making a nationwide enterprise of the business of collecting the evidence and using the evidence. I think from reading some of your previous evidence sessions that a lot of other speakers have covered the fact that it's not straightforward, the input, activity, output, outcome model for culture, because, you know, culture is something that's very deeply embedded in psychology and community. So I think the other thing is about making sure that we're taking a wide view of that it's as important that people study each other's evidence of how things work as to be able to say in a wide-scale way that culture does work. And I think that's one of the places where large clusters of organisations like the Edinburgh Festivals can really play a national leadership role. So the evidence study that we commissioned collectively in 2010, which has been studied around the world, was one of the first to look not just at economic impact for our group of festivals, but also at measures of cultural and social and indeed environmental impact. And, you know, I think that's something that can stand for Scotland's record in this area, and we could make a lot more of that. I think that we've been trying to work with universities, not simply the University of Edinburgh, but we spent quite a lot of time working with the University of Edinburgh, particularly because of the Edinburgh City Region deal, which provides funding for them to become a centre of data excellence. And we are looking at the opportunities to really mine all that data that exists, because there's a huge amount of data that exists, and put it to use. It's the same with Creative Scotland. You know, they do ask for a lot of reporting for the regular funding and the project funding and the special funding that they provide, but they don't have the capacity at the moment really to mine that data and to take the learning out of it. We were very lucky last year to be able to secure some funding from for a researcher from the University of Edinburgh through a Research Council grant, which was about training researchers to work with industry, so that we could mine 10 years of data of the Scottish Government's Festivals Expo Fund, which is supporting new Scottish productions to find international audiences and international buyers through the platform of Edinburgh's festivals. And that was fascinating. You know, we found out that 500,000 audience a year is attracted to new Scottish work as a result of that scheme, that 20% of those productions are presented in community settings, even though that's not actually the purpose of the scheme, you know. And all of that learning, I think, has helped us to develop how we use that scheme, and has helped other festivals which have recently come into that scheme, Glasgow International and Celtic Connections, to understand how that can best work for the benefit of the whole of Scotland.
Thank you very much. Ken?
I'll just reiterate the points. There's an awful lot of information being gathered from a lot of organisations, and I have, on the whole, no idea what happens to it. And as an organisation, so I'm representing Culture Aberdeen because, as well as the Edinburgh International Film Festival and Filmhouse in Edinburgh, we also run Belmont Filmhouse in Aberdeen, and we're part of a collaborative network there. The challenge we've got is we have to report to a local authority in Aberdeen. As a business, we are reporting to a local authority in Edinburgh, we're reporting to the Scottish Government, we're reporting to Creative Scotland. All are asking different questions. There's overlaps, but the data is inconsistent and uncoordinated. So it's partly a capacity issue for whoever it is has got it, but it's also why do they want it in the first place? And I think if you could sort of bring it back up the chain of going, what are the key things we're actually looking for here, and then gather the data that allows us to work out whether it is working or not, that would be a better starting point.
Okay. One of the suggestions in the research that the committee commissioned was a national cultural observatory. Do you think that that would reduce the bureaucratic burden on the sector, or is it adding another layer of bureaucracy?
I think that would be a great idea. I think that one of the things we said in our evidence is that working with academia is fantastic, but it's not straightforward because there are different drivers and different business models. So some of the work that we've done with recently around the Edinburgh City Region deal is about trying to align those drivers and make sure that we're getting outcomes that work for the university sector and work for the culture sector and the wider audiences and citizens. Because often these centres are set up and they have to chase funding. And if they're chasing funding, that's for article publication or for certain kinds of metrics in the research excellence framework. So I think the important thing would be for it to be a genuine cross-sector partnership. And looking at some of the evidence that the report that you commissioned surveyed across different countries, I see that in Ireland, it's the Irish Research Council who's provided some funding for that centre to get off the ground. And I think that's an excellent idea. I think we also said in our evidence that the Scottish Funding Council ought to be part of a strategic nationwide effort to look at how we pull this kind of data together and use it both to make our own system better, but also to become a kind of beacon in the world as well.
Thanks. You touched on international comparisons, which is another major theme of that Drew Wiley research. Are you able to say anything more? I know you have done in your written evidence about what countries we should be benchmarking ourselves against? And what's your view on the suggestion in the research that Scotland should consider establishing an international network of countries that we benchmark against?
So a lot of the countries that came up are countries that the Edinburgh Festivals have relationships with, and through us we seek to develop relationships with the whole of Scotland. A good example is Canada. As a result of the relationships that we've developed over the past 5 years, there's now been a very strong Canadian presence for 3 years at the Edinburgh Festivals around a new venue called the Canada Hub, but also nationwide initiatives. So an Indigenous producer and artist from Canada has held an artist seminar in Arran and has worked with artists from across the Highlands and Islands and the Central Belt in presenting work in Edinburgh. So, you know, I think that sort of benchmarking does happen in the kind of living act of developing these collaborations, and that's very positive. There's lots of ways, and I think Jen had some ideas about how we could build on that. I am more attracted to the national infrastructure being supportive of those kinds of links developing than of forming a kind of overarching benchmarking club, which we would all contribute to in the same countries, because I think we have differing interests across different parts of the culture sector, and that is a very good thing, because between all of us we cover, well, across all the 11 Edinburgh festivals that I represent, we cover 85 different countries. They're not obviously all of the same strategic importance to us, and there are many things that can be done with an important cluster of Nordic countries, of European countries, and of, say, Commonwealth countries. So I think that's an obvious area to focus on. But the kind of policy interests of the Scottish Government, for example, are going to be at a different level from the interests of independent artists who want to meet other independent artists and producers and promoters and presenters who can feature them internationally. So I'm not sure if the observatory idea would speak to some of the objectives that we have as the Edinburgh Festivals, although it might speak to other objectives.
Okay. Jennifer?
Yes, I would agree with all of that. One of the things we've done recently was chaired a group of UK music export companies in Glasgow. And something that came out of that was how important moving around and making the connections are to the business. Particularly now that we don't have the big models that we used to have. So we used to have big record company models. You don't have that so much right across all the creative industries. So it's really valuable for people to be able to move around, make connections with other people, work in partnership. So that's why we would kind of prioritise the actual work over measuring ourselves against what other countries might be doing, if you see what I mean.
Ken?
Again, agree. I think being part of a club is great, but I think the starting point is we need to get ourselves sorted and then work out, are there others there that there might be sufficient commonality with in terms of objectives and methodologies and so on that we want to work with. Absolutely learn from others, but I think stage one is we seem to be starting from a position where we've got a lot of stuff, but we don't have that observatory, we don't have the right kind of partnership in place to deliver this. So if we could get that in place first, that would seem to be my priority.
I have a supplementary on this topic from Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. It's regarding the observatory. Instead of actually establishing a standalone organisation, which obviously would have no doubt quite considerable cost in terms of bureaucracy, would it be better off to have some type of organisation within an existing body, so that that bureaucracy can be reduced in terms of so more money can actually go to delivering culture and arts?
I think that the job of the observatory would be, for me, the main job that I would give them if I was allowed to give them a job, would be to build the open source framework that lets us understand what works, because that's what's valuable. In terms of who would be in that network, I have a big list that I could read out, which would bore everyone, but it's something that I can provide as evidence if people would like. And it's, as you say, you know, Data Lab, Informatics at Edinburgh and whatnot. So yeah, that's what I would have them do. I think having that the framework and the model and the tools, the digital tools, is for me what I would want an observatory to achieve. So I don't know if you have to start up something that is a long-term thing, or you start up something that's a group that you put together to achieve a goal, and once they've achieved the goal, you look at whether or not you keep it and they have another goal, or you don't.
I think there's a model that we could look at in the way that the Arts and Humanities Research Council have set up the Creative Industries research programme that has funded 3 institutions in Scotland so far. University of Abertay-Dundee is leading a cluster around games. The Centre for Cultural Policy Research at Glasgow is leading Scotland's efforts in the Policy and Evidence Centre that is being created as a network organisation, as Jen says, UK-wide, to develop our understanding of this area. And Edinburgh is leading on a culture and creative industries cluster about bringing data innovation into the culture and creative industries in a bigger way to create new kind of experiences and products and business models. So I think that's an example of how the sort of thing that Jen is talking about could work. I think universities probably are the natural place to cite something of that nature.
But I do think that it's how the others are plugged in. So, for example, if you wind the clock back, it was interesting reading the Culture Counts evidence, because it wound the clock back 10, 11 years to the Creative Scotland Bill back in 2008. And at that point, Creative Scotland was being set up to be the big brain. It was being set up to have the research capability and capacity that would inform itself, but also to inform the sector and inform government. And obviously, for a variety of reasons, that hasn't happened in the way that it was intended. But if you're then looking forward 10 years, where might that observatory be? What would its role be in informing strategy and decision making within government and within public funding bodies?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to look at the need for national and local strategic cooperation here. And just to start off with, there was some interesting stuff in the Culture Counts submission around the new framework in Ireland for coordination between the Arts Council of Ireland and their county and town city councils. Jennifer, would you be able to expand on that a little bit?
What they do is they ensure through match funding that every local authority in Ireland has an arts team. So they kind of fund they part fund, match fund the fundamental arts team in local authorities. They can then go out and source other funds from enterprise agencies, private investment, philanthropy. But I guess it's just that Ireland has an understanding that if you don't have some boots on the ground, then you're not going to be able to achieve very much. You know, you can't just have the odd activity. You need to have some people working there to build the cultural sector locally. So yeah, that's what happens in Ireland. I think that would work well here because it's very difficult for councillors to win arguments locally for culture when they're faced with choosing emptying bins or education. You know, it's difficult. So that would enable them, I think, to win a lot more arguments locally about funding culture if they were able to bring match funding along.
Thank you. And I'd be interested in all of your experience of what the state of play at the moment is in Scotland in that alignment of national and local priorities. If we go back 10 years ago where there was far more spending at a local level on arts and culture, it was quite different. But in a situation where that spending significantly reduced, the staff capacity within local authorities for cultural departments is vastly diminished. Has that resulted in there being even less alignment, or has it resulted in some situations of there actually being a more focused approach within certain local authorities that maybe in a particular sector has resulted in something more positive?
What can give the Aberdeen experience is that this current financial year saw a 19% cut in funding for culture, so the alignment bit not necessarily. I think the challenges, as Jen sets it out, is that because there isn't a statutory requirement for local authorities to be bothered about culture, when they've got a lot of other things to be bothered about, that's what their focus is. One of the things we've been discussing in Aberdeen is how we can promote culture to be at the table within the community planning partnerships, which have everyone else sat at the table but not culture, and how far that's a route in to combining the national performance framework and with the cultural outcome and the indicators with what should happen at a local level. And so it provides the strategic framework. I think having a statutory obligation becomes more and more important, because otherwise it will forever fall off the list. And that then creates the opportunity for dovetailing the two, of saying, right, well, what are we trying to achieve nationally, what are we trying to achieve locally, and how can we work together to achieve that? But at the moment, whatever the ambition is locally is always trumped by emptying the bins or making sure kids get education.
I know you've heard from other witnesses in previous sessions about the fact that Edinburgh's culture spending as a city council is lower than many others in Scotland for various different reasons, but they have tried to protect to a degree the funding that has been allocated to third-party organisations through grants, but it has dropped by 18% over the past the last 3 years and the following 2 years. The funding to the festivals will have dropped by 18%, and obviously at a time when all these other factors are happening that mean that there's a crunch in terms of public funding, and getting other sources of funding are getting more competitive. You know, that means that there is a very difficult conundrum to solve for local authorities in their support of culture. Where we've seen a really interesting development in Edinburgh is a conversation that started around the Edinburgh City Region deal, which was about how could we make the most of the platforms that the Edinburgh festivals provide to foster inclusive economic growth through culture, because inclusive economic growth is obviously the focus of the city region deals and not other objectives of culture. So that's why it was focused on that conversation. So that got the festivals, the City Council, the Scottish Government and the UK Government, in fact, around the table talking about that. And that was very exciting. Unfortunately, at the 11th hour, UK Government concluded that they would not invest in culture as part of the Edinburgh City Region deal because of the terms in which City Region deals are drawn. But the positive outcome for Scotland was that we carried on that conversation, and out of that conversation came the PLACE programme, the Platforms for Creative Excellence programme, which is Edinburgh's festival's place-based initiative with funding that we've raised against the match funding from the city and from the Scottish Government. They put in $1 million each every year, and a commitment for a 5-year programme, which has been completely transformative, because being able to have that kind of long-term view and being able to leverage additional funding through that long-term lens means that we've been able to reach out and work in more communities than ever, and work in more communities in the way that they want to be worked with, so that we are going in and asking what's important to them and how culture can help them achieve that. Because a lot of funding is on an annual basis. Communities have told us all probably that they get fed up, understandably, of people coming in and saying, "Oh, I've got some money this year to do a thing with you." You know, so this approach is, we're at the start of it in this year, is really, we believe and are confident, going to transform the way that we're able to work with not only the communities of the city region, but also the creatives of the city region, and be able, again, because a lot of funding tends to come in on an annual basis, it's very difficult to organise support for new commissions that has a tour built in, a tour around Scotland. We find the only organisation among our cluster who's able to do that is the Children's Festival and Imaginate, their year-round organisation. And that's because of where they sit within the festival's calendar. It means they get 15 months advance warning of the funding that's going to be available to them for new Scottish commissions through the Expo Fund. And that means they're able to set up a Scottish tour across locations across the whole of Scotland, as well as being able to feature them in Edinburgh. So if there is alignment between timescales and objectives and governance of the funds at that local and national level, amazing things can happen.
Really useful. And just finally, I'm wondering if we are in the situation, say, that kind of ideal scenario here from many folk in the sector's perspective of that statutory requirement around alignment, I'm wondering how well set up Creative Scotland is to deliver their side of that at present. Obviously, capacity is one issue, and that's an annual debate over their budget, etc. But in terms of the structures that would be required at a national level to support this, how well set up do you think Creative Scotland is, or what changes would be needed in the structure of Creative Scotland if there was far more focus on that alignment, that support for local authority level work?
Blimey. Maybe ask their new chief executive once they're appointed how to deal with that. I think the challenge they've got is there's sort of their starting point, and how far, it goes back to the earlier point, how far they see themselves in that research and advocacy role, that development role, as well as being a funder. And certainly my experience over the 9 years of Creative Scotland is that the focus has been primarily on the funding aspect, and therefore has been primarily on the process of funding. So it would require quite a shift in its mindset to then enter that. Then you can start looking at the capability and capacity issues about what they need on the ground. Part of the conversations, again, a dozen years ago, were how far there could be devolution of responsibilities to either a regional or local level, so that you no longer have a central body in Glasgow or Edinburgh being viewed with distrust by anyone outside the central belt, but you'd have both decision makers and funding located in the different regions or different local areas across the country. That's happened in part for very small pots of money, but it's how far that could then be used as part of the leverage of saying, right, well, Creative Scotland's going to be putting in a chunk of cash with people with decision-making power alongside what we would then expect as the local cash or regional cash to be at the table as well. So I think there's scope for improvement.
I wouldn't think that Creative Scotland currently have the budget to effectively match fund in the way I was describing in Ireland. I think it would cost about 10 million minimum increase in their budget to have a police programme that really made a difference. The money's just not there. It would have to come out of direct funding for all the work that's currently done. That would have to be cut to do the local authority stuff, so that's a decision. Then it comes back to the interpretation of the remit. Is that their remit? It doesn't really look like it. They're trying to piece together, I think, the police partnerships to try and make up for this huge gap, but I think without the money, there's really only so much that can happen there.
I think they've shown a willingness to, so in the case of the Edinburgh City Region Place programme, the Scottish Government has, and indeed City of Edinburgh Council, have signed their money over to Creative Scotland to be the kind of managing agent of that programme. So I know that they're very excited about that as a new model. Whether it's replicable and scalable to 32 local authorities, I think, I would take on board the points that colleagues have made.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. You've touched on this morning the massive pressures facing the whole cultural sector about where you go. And that has come about through the national and the local priorities that you're trying to set within your own locations and within your own geographical areas. But you've already said today that you don't have that reach when it comes to like community planning partnerships. You don't have that. You're not at the table. It may well be, well-being and education and others who are there. So how do you feel that you should be given that role? Because in local government, as you've already identified, education seems to be given the lion's share of the resource that may fall into some areas that may be looking at culture and trying to look at the opportunities that are made. But what real negotiation and real practice do you have between the organisations that you represent and the local government and the education, or the individuals who have that opportunity to give you that power to come and sit at a table?
A good question. I mean, if I can just go to the Community Empowerment Act, which underpins the community planning partnerships, you have a whole list of folk who are there as statutory community planning partners. So it includes Skills Development Scotland, it includes Scottish Enterprise, it includes Scottish Natural Heritage, it includes Sport Scotland. So it's including all the national bodies responsible for their respective patches. And none of us have got the individual capacity to do it, or the individual authority to be sitting on those community planning partnerships. You're therefore saying, right, well, which body at a national level could have that position? And it almost goes back to Ross's point about the role for Creative Scotland. But again, you would go, does it have the capacity itself to do that? But if you look at, I mean, it's 15, 20 organisations who are all have the right to be there and they're obliged to be there, and culture isn't there.
You have that local knowledge, you have that local understanding that you could bring something to that. And without you being there, then you are being excluded. You are not being given the opportunities. Your organisations are left out, and that's blatantly obvious across the locations. And if you were given that chance to be at that table and to give some influence and to get some spin-off, because you would, there's no question you would, you'd make a bid for various things and you'd get that, because you would show that the potential for well-being or security or empowerment in the community or all of that is there. So that's a glaring miss that we seem to have, and that has to be changed to ensure that we get going forward. So, but as I said, what do you think we should be doing? Because we can help you in some respects to try and make that happen.
The obvious solution to me is Creative Scotland, because it does have that national position. I think the challenge, it does come back to the earlier points about their individual capacity at a particular moment in time. But in terms of absolutely agreeing with you that culture should be at the table, but it needs to be at the table with sufficient teeth. If it's just there purely because it's a nice idea to have culture, and everyone else is there because there's a statutory obligation for them there, that's a different thing. So as long as it had that heft behind it, then great.
You know, culture, you talked about in your submission about the lack of understanding between the layers of government. And that's so obvious that we don't seem to have that real knowledge and understanding between what's going on. I mean, you're providing the services and the facilities and doing the role. They have the strategy that they want to try and see, and they've got ambition for their cultural strategy and ambition for what culture should be doing. But there's a mismatch between the two. And we need to try and identify how that can be managed for you better so that we can support the individuals and organisations that you represent. Because if we don't do that, then once again, it's going to erode and erode, because we've already heard there's financial constraints about where you are, there's pressure, all of that is being taken into the equation. But you've identified where we should go, but it needs to take that extra step. And government have to take that leap of faith to ensure that you get that.
Yeah, I think that Creative Scotland would be ideal. They're the only organisation big enough to be able to cover getting across all of those deals, because that would take serious skills and experience. And in every local authority, there isn't a Julia Moore. So yeah, it would take, even for Creative Scotland, it would be a really big job, and they would have to, I guess, try and bring in the skills to lead that. But yeah, I think it's definitely possible.
Okay.
I think the other thing that is a great hook for us to achieve some of this is what's being talked about in the National Cultural Strategy, and in particular, the new discourse about making sure that culture is seen as a tool for all sorts of public policy objectives. I don't mean that in a reductive, instrumentalist way, but that we won't become a fairer, more inclusive, outward-looking nation unless we are a kind of culturally confident and culturally empowered nation, you know. And to give that teeth, as Ken says, I think that I I was struck when I was reading some of the national cultural strategies of international comparators. Quebec recently published theirs, and South Australia recently published theirs, and they all had a foreword from the premier of their country. And I think that if we can have a cross-cabinet approach to that national cultural strategy and have policy proofing in all portfolios of, what can culture bring to the party in this area, then that's going to set the right tone for all the local discussions to then follow from it.
And that follows on sort of the whole purpose behind what the funding should be about and how the funding should be distributed to ensure that you get your lion's share of that. Because as I say, at the moment, it's quite different across different areas, different regions. There's not a commonality and that's going forward. So I think that if it was better informed, and how would you consider what decisions should be looked upon when it comes to funding in that process about what the priorities should be?
Well, so from the Festivals Edinburgh point of view, we are very conscious that it's a whole interdependent system, and each part of that system needs to be respected. Obviously, independent artists are a focus of this inquiry and have an increasingly challenging time making a living. And so the conditions for independent artists need to be thought about. It's also, I think, inarguable that it's partnerships between independent artists, freelance producers, cultural organisations who can help them get their work seen and find audiences and make livelihoods that makes our whole cultural system work. And so I think one of the focuses should be on how do we make more of the interdependencies of that system. So again, under this place programme for the Edinburgh Festivals, two of the strands of that programme around increasing creative development for artists and as well as increasing the community engagement of audiences. So I think that balance and interdependency needs to be thought about very carefully.
Thank you.
Thank you. Annabelle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Turning to the specific issue of peer review, you may have followed our debates in the committee in terms of evidence received on the subject, and there are differing views on that, but it'd be interesting to hear what you think. So do you feel that peer review should be reintroduced into the process?
Do you mean funding processes?
Yes.
I think peer review, I don't have a lot of experience of peer review myself, but I know that we are a very small country, and sometimes that can make peer review difficult, because sometimes your reviewer will be someone that's competing for the same funds as you. And I don't know how you manage that in such a small country. That's one of the concerns I have about it. I don't know if anyone else has.
It's not something that festivals have kind of come to an official position on. I know that from the Drew Riley report that a lot of other countries do use it in their systems and do have protocols for trying to manage that around rotating people who are on the panels on a regular basis, and also looking for advisors who are not necessarily from within our system, as well as not obviously being the majority of people on the panels. But and in a way, when we do panels, some of my individual member festivals, like the Fringe, for example, runs the Made in Scotland programme, which selects around 20 works each year to feature in the Fringe in partnership with Creative Scotland and the Federation of Scottish Theatre. And their decision panels have a mix of people from within our system and international guest selectors. So I guess if you were going to do it, then these are some of the techniques that you might need to use to kind of hedge the process and balance the process out.
And I think just picking up on that is ensuring that it's part of a bigger process of understanding what's going on with either an individual artist, individual piece of work, to inform decision making. And I think it's just being clear about the role, if there's going to be peer review, what the role is of that review. Is it actually to take a decision, or is it going, here is one viewpoint, and understanding it as one viewpoint, and there might be 2 or 3 viewpoints that you need to get before you can then take the actual decision. But obviously, the more of that you have, the more cumbersome you're making a process, which for the individual applicant, whether a small individual artist or a small organisation, they don't have the time or capacity themselves to navigate that. So it's how you keep things simple and workable, whilst at the same time using it as and when. So it might be the peer reviews of processes, as opposed to necessarily of individual applications.
Okay, so you would foresee potentially that peer review could coexist along with other forms of decision making on a kind of hybrid peer review plus basis. So you wouldn't have the current position, you wouldn't go back to the Arts Council peer review, you would have something in the middle.
I honestly don't know how the Arts Council used to do it, so...
Well, they used to have a sort of peer review system, so you're suggesting you could foresee a system whereby you could have a peer review approach, but that would only be one element of the decision as to whether somebody is to receive funding. I think it needs to be appropriate.
Sorry, say again? It needs to be appropriate, sorry. I mean, going way back in time to Scottish Screen, it was set up, one of the organisations that was merged into it in 1997 was the Scottish Film Production Fund. And its panel was basically made up of the producers who were applying for the funding. And therefore, it was that conflict of interest was quite loud at that point in time. And so if folk didn't get money, they were unhappy, but it was their peers who were making the decision. So as Scottish Green evolved, it said, absolutely, we need expert input into enabling us to take a decision, but it wasn't those individuals actually taking that decision. It was using their expertise to inform the decision. Okay. But I don't know how far that links into how the Arts Council used to do it or not.
Well, I certainly, taking the point made about how do you manage peer review in a country with not a huge population, I mean, obviously, I think Julia had suggested that you could have a rotation of membership, for example, and to deal with Ken's point, obviously, you would require to declare your interest. You could have so-called high-level artists in whatever sector it is, diversify the membership, have a sort of rolling invitation to come onto a panel, I suppose, depending upon... I mean, do you see that as workable in practice, that kind of approach? I mean, certainly there has been a strong clamouring on the part of some people we have heard from who want to see some sort of peer review back in the system. So seeing if we could consider that, but on a workable basis, taking into account some of the, the issues raised, including from Jennifer.
It's not something we've ever talked to our members about, although I could do a survey if it would be useful to get some information on that and feed it back to you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
It's something we could do. That'd be useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Could I just ask the supplementary on that, or maybe just a point of clarification? The artists that we've spoken to who raised the issue of peer review, as Annabelle said, I think the thing that was most concerning them is that in the application process, particularly to Creative Scotland, their applications were being assessed by people who didn't know their art form at all. And they very articulately outlined why they thought that was wrong. Obviously, when and they didn't have any confidence in decisions made about their art form by people who were completely new to it. Do you think they've got a valid point there?
I would understand their concerns.
Yeah.
I think that the point that Ken made about proportionality is really important. That you might want to, if you wanted to design a framework with that embedded in it, you'd need to look at what size of decisions you were applying that to, if you like. Because I know another thing that independent artists have understandably said is that the burden of administration of applying for funds as an individual is too high.
Okay. Thank you very much. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. Just a couple of questions regarding the marketing and branding, but I've got a wee question beforehand. It's been when we had the session in Ayr, there was a suggestion put forward regarding a percentage for arts funding method in terms of any capital projects that are taking place within local authority areas. Is that something that you would support?
in Edinburgh, we've been talking to the planners about the new planning framework, and I know Culture Counts has been doing work on the planning bill, and I think that the opportunity to see some cultural gain from developments in the way that we're quite used to seeing infrastructural gain and educational gain is really, really attractive. My understanding, talking to the planning teams in the local authorities, is that the range of levers that local authorities have to make that happen is relatively limited. But I think at both the national level and the city level, that's something that we've been looking at with great interest. And I don't know if my colleagues would want to comment on that.
I think it would depend on the area, really, what the needs of the area are. And also I think that, you know, if you had a fundamental standard level of cultural production in each area, you wouldn't have that argument, you know, because people would understand, well, this is production over here and that's a capital project, you know.
Okay.
I agree. I mean, I think the other risk of it becomes a focus on a number, as opposed to going, what are we actually doing, and why are we doing it, and how are we doing it, and how you then construct that number. So is it, you know, a percentage, 1% of the total building cost, but what's the total building cost? I mean, you start getting into definitions of, well, have you got the fit-out costs within that or not? And then what do you do with it? And a part of the challenge that is underway with the transient visitor levy consultation is what might you want to spend it on if you were raising additional revenues, but secondly, who makes those decisions? What process is in place? Or does it just go into a central pot and it just gets spent on other things, and that it gets defined, for example, that we're improving cultural amenity because we're filling in potholes, because we're actually making it easier for folk to get around the city. And you're going, well, no, that's surely a different budget head. But if you leave it too vague, then folk will not play ball. So I think if it were to be there, it needs to be really clear exactly what the percentage is, how it's derived, what it's getting spent on, who takes the decision.
So I know certainly an organisation in my constituency, Rig Arts, I know it's something that they pursued when we had the session in here, and they've raised it with this committee. And I know that there's in my area there has been a huge investment that's went into a particular part of Greenock, where Rig have been hugely involved in terms of the cultural element. So without having the percentage for arts, so they managed to obtain funds, which has helped hugely with that development and having that, making people have that ownership of the area once again. So without having that actual structure, I've seen the job that has been done, but to actually have that formalised structure, I could see the opportunity, and it could potentially also have make it a bit easier for organisations to obtain funding and have a longer term set of planning as compared to from contract to contract.
I think Jen's point about being clear, in fact, and Ken as well, in fact, about being clear about what it's for and having that mix of purposes, capital and recurrent, is very important, because there's a lot of innovative ways of generating community cultural assets, like asset transfer being talked about now, and sometimes working very well, but also you have to be very clear that you're not actually giving civic-minded community citizens a pig in a poke, that it's a capital asset, but there's no money to continue to run it, and it's not really a going concern. So I think if we were able to draw on, ways of attracting more funding to support culture is absolutely the million-dollar question here, and if that can help, I think that would be very welcome. And to do that, we need to look at the different ways in which culture needs that long-term support.
That then kind of takes me on to the question about branding and marketing. And if that type of funding was there, as one example, Do you think that can actually help with the branding and the marketing of a particular area, as well as helping to attract investment to create that the sustainable funding environment?
Short answer is yes. If you look at Aberdeen, has made huge strides over the last 20 years by investing more in its festivals and getting local community more actively involved, but also putting Aberdeen on a map as a cultural city. Part of the challenge over the last 2 years is a large chunk of that funding has gone, and therefore the message being sent out is Aberdeen is no longer that kind of city, and that's high risk, I think. So I think absolutely, if there's sufficient and sustained investment, it can be absolutely transformative, and whether it's at city level or much more locally. The challenge is getting, as Julia was explaining earlier, on the whole, the funding is at best annual. And so to have that long-term plan isn't possible, because you're constantly just chasing to make sure you've got enough to keep going a little bit longer. So if there was that commitment from both national and local funding bodies, both strategically as well as funding-wise, it absolutely has the power to transform.
This is where the likes of every local authority area goes through a local development plan process. Through that process, you then would have an indication as to kind of what projects are going to come down the line over that 5-year period of time, and also get an indication in terms of what funding. So if you had that guarantee, or sort of that certainty in terms of the funding, then it would certainly help with the branding, the marketing, and then also the then rollout and development of the cultural activities. Would that be a fair assumption?
I think you're absolutely right that it needs to be that package of measures. I mean, again, we've been talking to the development planning people in Edinburgh, and there are all sorts of great objectives about making sure Edinburgh remains as affordable as possible for artists and makers. But that's a challenge, obviously, because we're a very kind of a city that's attractive to global capital. So I think having both the planning and the zoning and an initiative that has got some revenue stream behind it to actually make it happen is very, very important. The area of Edinburgh, I think 15 years ago, this is the kind of lead times also, of course, that we need to think in, around Bellevue at the top of Leith Walk, that was zoned for small ateliers for makers. And 15 years later, you look and it's just filled with housing. I mean, I'm sure it's very nice housing, but it's when those plans are not realised because all of those pieces are not in place. I think it would be great to have more support through the policy frameworks to make sure that all of those pieces are in place.
So what other steps would you want to see the Scottish Government undertake regarding the national approach, but also the local approach, to have that kind of collaborative funding method, and as well as looking at both public, private, and other types of investment?
Maybe defer to Jen around planning, yeah, and the work we've been doing around the legislation. Yes.
Could you just ask me that again?
Sure. What other steps do you think the Scottish Government should undertake regarding having that type of collaborative model, looking at both public, private, and also any other types of funding to go in to help with provide that certainty and have a better outcome?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so things at the moment are very separate. We've established that. How we connect them, I think one of the ideas was, initially in this meeting we were talking about what the data framework would look like in terms of inputs, outputs, what works. One of our ideas is to look at how culture works through health, through education, through the justice sector, through the creative economy, and have that as part of that data measurement framework. Then you can look at what your goals are. So what are your goals for culture and health? What are your goals for justice and health? And you would look through that framework model of how do we jointly achieve this. That would then, we hope, create partnership opportunities between the cultural sector and the justice sector, for example, and get them working together to achieve a goal. So it would be a kind of goal-led framework which would open up the partnership opportunities between the different areas, which would automatically connect up to the national level from the local level.
Okay.
Another model that I've spoken with some of your colleague MSPs about is the DCMS Cultural Development Fund, which has been funded, as I understand it, through the industrial strategy, which obviously, because of the reserved and devolved matters, that comes through in a very different way for prioritisation for spending in Scotland. If, heaven forfend, you know, Brexit were to release funds that needed to be redeployed for other purposes, you know, I think it's important for Scotland to be very clear about, you know, how we would stimulate our economy to deal with that shock, you know, and if there was funding available for place-based interventions, you know, then the programme that's been put together for Edinburgh and other models that happen to exist in other UK countries and abroad could maybe provide a framework for thinking about how national and local government could come together to make those interventions. And the National Cultural Strategy, again, I think that commitment of that document to place-based interventions is really important. And Scottish Enterprise and the way that their strategy is going under their new chief executive, I think could help, because they're very much talking about place-based partnerships as well. And one of the important aspects of making it all stack up in the way that Jen described is having that wider view of the benefits for an inclusive, sustainable economy that culture can provide, so that the indicators and the key performance indicators and the drivers are correct, and the business cases are not always turning up the answer that you should invest this stuff in new road junctions, that actually it's worth investing in communities through culture as well.
If I can just add on the back of that, so two very simple things. One is actually going back to the earlier point about giving culture a statutory footing. So if within the National Cultural Strategy there's something about that then links it into community planning partnerships to allow that to happen, then that would be good. Second thing is money. Because an awful lot, I mean, I know this is arts funding. Quite simply, one of the reasons this conversation is happening is because there isn't enough money to allow us to do all the things we want to do. There's a lot less money in real terms than there was 10 years ago. If you go back to the Cultural Commission report in 2005, at that point it was saying there was a need for an extra £100 million a year to go into the cultural sector, and I think it released an extra 10 million or so into the combined Scottish Arts Council, Scottish Screen at the time. It becomes quite straightforward. Now, how much? We need to go away and come back with a precise number, but an awful lot of this would be an awful lot more straightforward if there was just more hard cash on the table.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Donald.
Thank you. And can I apologise? I just joined this committee, so I'm joining the inquiry midway, and I apologise for not being quite up to speed on several of the issues. Can I take up Stuart McMillan's point about collaborative funding? I was very struck by the submission of Festivals Edinburgh when you stated that you, having lost quite a lot of financial services sponsors, you have managed to sort of get over that, albeit it was challenging, by diversifying, and that I think you are now at a, you know, you have achieved a level of funding, but I think you use the expression it's a stretch. Do I take that to mean that there are more organisations after less money, effectively? Is that the general?
In a big way, yeah. So you've got trusts and foundations, you've got corporate donors, and you've got individual donors, broadly speaking. And in all of those areas, obviously, more people are being encouraged to seek diversified funding, and people are getting better at it. Of course, we've listened to a lot of, that's a stretch for big organisations like some of the organisations that I represent. It's even more of a stretch for smaller freelancers or independent artists. I mean, that's one of the reasons why having organisations like the Edinburgh Festivals, who operate on a national and international scale, is an advantage to the system, because actually we can do that legwork and then make the levered in income available to artists. So out of the Expo Fund, for example, nearly 90% of the funding that comes in through the Expo Fund, public and private, is going straight back out again to artists to commission and to produce their work. And it's the same with other areas of our programme. So that's one of the reasons why we invest in strategic national cultural infrastructure. And we have been very successful at it, but the more diverse sources of funding you pursue, the more you have to invest in pursuing those sources of funding. And with things like trusts and foundations, with many of those obviously have had their bequests invested in stock markets. Mm-hmm. Those have not been going up in the way that they did in the previous decade. They have a finite pot to distribute. So with everybody getting better at providing high quality applications to that pot, it doesn't mean that the strike rate increases. You could be getting better and better and better, and your strike rate can still decrease. So a bit of a conundrum. Yeah.
Right. And can I ask the other panel witnesses, do you recognise the same picture in Aberdeen, for example?
It's absolutely the same. It's the same in Aberdeen, same in Edinburgh, same in Glasgow. Yeah. Increasing pressure on reducing resources. Because as one bit of, so the funding ecosystem is quite a fragile thing. And if one bit goes down, so if local authority funds in Aberdeen go down by 19%, the only way we can continue doing what we're doing is by looking at alternative sources. But it's affecting all the other cultural organisations as well. So we all then start chasing those other areas, which puts increasing pressure on those. And unless those sums have gone up, then it's a conundrum. But it also means we spend more and more money on chasing money, which I think is slightly absurd as well. So we sort of pride ourselves because we've got really good development teams who are really adept at going out, raising funds, reporting on funds, so on. And you're going, Paul, going back to the beginning of the conversation, we're having to report back just in public sector terms to 5 different bodies. And once you then add in the commercial sponsors, the individual donors, the trusts and foundations, they're all asking for different outputs as well and different things to report on. So it's very complex, but as one bit of the ecosystem shifts, then we have to adapt to that, but the rest of the actual funding bit can't, because unless more money comes to the table.
As well, and there's another part of the conundrum, it seems, because as well as the different sources of income demanding different outcomes, as you say, is there also, it seems from the submission, that there could be an impact on artists who, if there are multiple income streams, that their artistic freedom might be somehow constrained, which I think none of us would obviously want to happen. Is that a real issue? And if it is, how do we solve it?
I think it's important to look at the landscape, which is really complex, in terms of production and distribution. So instead of thinking about some things are non-profit and they're just for community benefit and other things are commercial, it's important to make the distinction that actually it's a big ecosystem. So there's really just how you invest in production of work and how you then distribute that work. Trying to think of an example. Yeah, so Stuart, when you were talking about the example of having a percentage of capital funds to go towards activity, that would be in my cultural production box. However, if that was how you done things everywhere, it would mean that there wasn't any sustainability in cultural production, because if a building one year was 2 million, the percentage would be different than a building the next year that was 500,000. So it would mean that there would be no sustainability on the ground for the production of work. And if you don't have the production of work and you don't have that landscape of experimentation when people can make decisions about what to make, then you're going to have less likely to have commercial success because you've got less production of work. And you can't decide what's going to have commercial success in advance. It doesn't work like that. Cultural work that has commercial success is because it manages to connect with people in some way and then becomes popular. So you can make some decisions about what might work. In terms of just doing sponsorship work, people choose to do that. They've always chose to do that, and some people choose not to do that. There isn't a lot of it around, though.
In the submission by the International Festival to this inquiry, I noted that they mentioned that the more of their work being supported by corporate sponsors, the more corporate sponsors were likely to want to support work that was considered rather more safe than more experimental. And so Jen's absolutely right. We have to have that mixed economy. Even as we continue to diversify, there's absolutely essential foundational role for public funding in making sure that we can take risks and be experimental, and that artists can speak truth to power.
Yeah. I mean, I speak for myself. I find that very worrying, that there is a constraint on artistic expression if there is, if these multiple sources of funding, wherever they come from, create that atmosphere.
I think for some artists, for that reason, they don't choose to pursue those commercial routes. But and it's, thankfully, we do have a mixed economy, and so we are able to support all sorts of different kinds of work. But the danger is that if you rely on the market wholly to do your programming for you effectively, what you get is stuff that has mass market appeal, and you don't necessarily get people being supported that are going to be the next generation's, Hugh McDermott or Richard DeMarco. I was reading Richard DeMarco's evidence to the committee before I came today, and people like that obviously don't emerge through a system which is dominated by commercial interests.
Thank you very much. Kenneth?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Earlier on, we kind of touched on whether or not funding should be put on a kind of statutory basis, and I'm just wondering, it was 9 years since the Creative Scotland Bill kind of hit the buffer, so a completely new Parliament now in terms of personnel. I'm just wondering if that's something you believe should or should not be revisited.
Yes.
Can you?
No, as I said before, I had a privileged position in being involved in a lot of the discussions leading up to the establishment of Creative Scotland. And what started off as actually going back to the draft culture bill in 2007, it was absolutely intended that culture was going to have more of a statutory footing. You go past the Creative Scotland Bill 2008 and then to the Public Services Reform Bill in 2010, by that point it's just, we're setting up a body. And it's got 4 aims, can't remember what they are now. But it had shifted from, this is going to be transformational for the sector because it's a body that has got teeth, to this is a body that just needs to exist and it needs to get up and running. And so 10 years on, 9 years on from the Public Services Reform Bill, I would absolutely say, yes, now's the time to review whether the underpinning purposes of Creative Scotland are appropriate for what we need in the long term. The framing for that, though, I would suggest is with the National Cultural Strategy and what it would see as the key things that need to happen over that 10 years looking forward.
I think there's a sequencing thing for me. I would say that the number one priority for the Festival's Edinburgh members and see for the whole country is this question of how do we maximise the amount of investment and the connectivity of that investment in the sector. And so if going back into a massive cycle of legislative change around the governance of culture in Scotland would slow down the process of getting measures in place that address that issue of, I see there's been lots of cake and pie metaphors coming up during this inquiry, but that issue of getting a bigger cake, then I would be concerned. I wouldn't want legislative change to be diverting our attention from that first order issue.
Jennifer, have you got a view on it?
Yeah, it's difficult to know whether or not it would be possible to interpret it differently and not have to go through that process. One of the things that never really worked in my view was the Creative Industries Framework Agreement. So what's Scottish Enterprise role and what is the role of Creative Scotland? That was quite a difficult one because Scottish Enterprise at the time decided, well, we are about high growth companies, which basically crosses out most of the creative sector. So it means that the Creative Industry Framework Agreement would never really work if the statutory duty of Scottish Enterprise can change depending on who the director is. Completely changes how you would interpret what Creative Scotland's job is then. So it leaves things really up in the air, which means I think it needs to be re-examined and interpreted. Whether you have to change the legislation is another question. However, I don't think the interpretation just now works. I think it's got potential to fail because of those reasons. I also don't think that there's enough money to deliver the current remit.
Yeah, I mean, quite clearly, money is the #1 overriding issue, and I think the whole point about perhaps putting it back on a statutory footing is to try and secure funding and to give a wee bit of security, I think, to artists, know that there is there would be an amount of money and an amount of resource going forward, and that there would be statutory obligations in order to deliver that. I mean, one of the things was mentioned just in Donald's questioning was about corporate funding, but philanthropic and corporate funding, they're still very important. And how do you actually boost those? How do you get more, particularly from the philanthropic sector? There are so many different ways in which people can spend their money or give their money over as a legacy, whatever it happens to be, you know, from, you know, cancer research to dog and cat home. I mean, how does the arts get a bigger portion of that?
I think one of the reasons that doesn't really work here is because there isn't a lot of big Scottish companies to go and ask. So we've been thinking, we wonder if Scottish Enterprise could help connect the cultural sector to Scots abroad who run big companies in America and things, who might want to fund things over here. You know, that might be something that Scottish Enterprise, Scottish Development International could do because they have those contacts. So I think that could all be explored and we could see where that might go. But one of the problems is that at home here, there isn't actually that many companies to try and get hold of to get money from. The big companies that you would look for, like the equivalent that you have in America and Canada.
Yeah, so obviously the diaspora could be possibly approached now.
Yep.
You talked earlier at the panel about a cross-cutting approach. Everybody's culture should be everyone's responsibility in cabinet. You would still, of course, want a cabinet secretary with direct responsibility. Just wanted to definitely ensure that was the case, because I sometimes think if it's everyone's responsibility, it's no one's responsibility, and you still need someone to really drive the whole issue forward. Now, in the Drew Wiley report, it obviously looked at you know, the other 27 EU states out with the UK plus you know, Norway, Quebec, New Zealand. It's always you can't pick a cultural strategy off the shelf from another country, but which country do you think most resembles where you would want to be in terms of delivery of Scotland's cultural output? What would be which of these countries has a philosophy or a strategy, an approach that would best suit Scotland if the funding was available and we could adapt it to Scottish circumstances?
I think there are interesting things about all of those comparator countries, and I think our best possible future would be to be able to adopt some of those, the best of what we see in different countries abroad. I mean, obviously, I think we are all very interested in countries which have which recognise the special status of artists as creative workers, and that takes a different form in different countries. But in France and Germany, for example, they have special status within the social security system. In Canada and Quebec, there is legislation about the special status of the artist, and I think it might have been in the Culture Counts submission. We were talking about the fact that people can earn points towards their social security status from making applications to for funding for their artistic practice. You know, so I think that, and I'm struck by the amount that we've heard in different forums that we all sit on about the generation, probably my generation, that got started through some of the schemes that were available in the Thatcherite 80s, and how a lot of those forms of support are no longer available. So the status of artists and the ability of artists to sustain themselves while doing work that is good for them and good for their communities and good for society, I think would be one of the bits of practice that I'd be very, very interested in looking at.
Because interestingly, the country that seems to contribute significantly more than any other in Europe is Hungary, and yet it's a country that's not exactly known these days for its liberalism. So, you know, I'm just wondering if sometimes there can be a price to be paid.
Well, that was very interesting to me when I was reading Drew Wiley's report, that one of the observatories had done a survey of countries all over Europe about their the things they felt were shortcomings and priorities in their sector. And in Central and Eastern Europe, some of the main concerns were about state control and a lack of independent and high quality arts education. And so I think that does point up some of the differences between our system. I think the fact that the model here is very much trying to balance independence and organisations, and it's got that arm's length embedded in it, and it does seek to free up artists to make the work that they feel they need to make. I think that's absolutely critical.
Yeah, because you talked about the mixed economy, but it's not just corporations that can, you know, steer people towards a certain type or fund a certain type of art. I mean, the state can also do the same, although we don't do that here. Just finally, convener, if I can, in Annex B in the Drew Wiley report under contextual issues, he says when it comes to the arts funding process, the balancing of the technical requirements of applicants required to ensure objective assessment with the barriers that can be introduced to smaller or less experienced applicants is a common challenge, and that was touched on earlier. I'm just wondering how we square that circle to, as the report says, to ensure the need to provide longer-term funding certain to some organisations while having some flexibility of funding to reward success and respond to new developments. I mean, how do we resolve that? You know,
I think the starting point is just recognising one size doesn't fit all, and yes, that therefore, if you're an individual, the process you need to go through has to be very different to being a large organisation. The scale of the Edinburgh festivals on the whole is much greater than a number of the arts organisations in Aberdeen. You've got Aberdeen Performing Arts is by far and away the biggest cultural organisation in the city, and then we're probably next at a relative fraction of the size, and very quickly you're down to organisations with a turnover of a couple of 100,000, which in some ways you're going, well, great, but that's 3 or 4 members of staff, some activity, and that's it. And if you have 50 grand knocked off, then you're going to spend the next year trying to get that back in, but it's at a time when you don't actually have the capacity because you've probably reduced capacity. And therefore for the processes, it comes back to the simple one of what are we trying to achieve, why, and then how. And the process should be there to enable things to happen. And my experience over the years is a lot of processes are there to stop things happening, are there to make it more awkward. And to defend decisions. So the more process you've got, the more you can defend a decision. Whereas but actually, if one of the things we're trying to achieve is invest in risk.
And do you have a concern that having the skill to apply is more important sometimes than the actual artistic work that's produced or could be produced?
It could happen that way, yes. Mm-hmm. Because if my niece is an artist, and the prospect of her trying to fill in an application form for anything, she's a really good artist, so she would then work with somebody else to fill an application, but you're going, well, how do they then get paid for their time? It needs to be appropriate to what we're trying to achieve. I fully understand whether the funding body is Creative Scotland or a local authority or anyone else. they need to be clear about what they're trying to achieve and the processes and the transparency and accountability. But I do sense that probably in most cases it could be made an awful lot easier depending on the scale of the organisation.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to finish up with a few areas that we might not have covered already. You obviously represent strategic sectoral organisations, and it is very clear from your contributions today and your written contributions that you bring a considerable amount of expertise to the table, but you will be aware that a main thrust of this inquiry has been the way we support individual artists and cultural freelancers, and it's fair to say that some of the feedback that we're getting from them and the criticisms that we get from them about the funding process is that quite a lot of the funding has gone to strategic sectoral organisations who are competing for funds against individual artists, which, as we just heard, is very difficult for them to do that. How would you respond to those criticisms?
This actually ties into some of the ideas I had around what I would take from the Drew Wiley report. Because it is that argument again over the production, distribution, arts, creative industries, what's the benefit, all of this, who does what. I think it would be really interesting to look at having a pilot scheme for universal basic income for creative people, creative freelancers, to do one rural, one in a city, and see what the impact would be. Ideally, we would have the funds in local authority, like Ireland do, to match fund and have everything working there. But I think it would also be useful to just look at what a universal basic income for creative freelancers might look like. Ireland have this week launched a social welfare scheme for self-employed artists, where they have a year where they don't have to communicate with the job centre. They can just work on trying to get their business off the ground and their artistic work, and it stops them having to go to job centres and jump through hoops applying for jobs that they're not qualified for because they're an artist. So that's really good news there, and something like that here I think would work really well as well. I have heard about the new enterprise allowance, but I have to say I've never met or heard anyone who's ever received that. So I think it would also be interesting if the SPICE team could look into finding out how many people have actually received that. Be interesting to know. And the other thing, I guess, is just diversity in the sector. If you don't have this sustainability for production on the ground, the diversity of the sector will just be people who can afford to be in the game. So it will not improve unless that fundamental production is fixed on the ground, and these are measures to do that. So there's a range of things, and now also that Scotland has some social security powers, it might be the time to look at looking at what happens in Ireland and putting something like that in place to help that cultural production on the ground. And finally, in education, again, there's not a lot of statutory arts happens in education. So trying to bring that up to the same level as we see sports. In schools, we see PE and physical activity and physical health is very important. I think that we should see the arts in schools as really important for mental health and for teaching kids how to express themselves and manage emotions. And I think that art should have the same relevance in schools' curriculums as PE does.
Okay, thanks. Julie, you mentioned some of the schemes in the 80s and 90s. That was a big part of the feedback that we got from some of the older artists who had actually benefited from some of those schemes that were not actually designed for artists, but allowed artists the freedom to explore their creative practice without constantly having somebody on their back telling them to apply for jobs, stacking shelves and so on. Have you got any thoughts as to how we could reinvent those schemes?
Well, being very much part of that discussion that Jen's been talking about around different countries' approaches to the special status of artists and making it possible for them to sustain themselves while doing good for their communities. I think another discussion that we've got underway is with Scottish Enterprise and how their new place-based approach could see artists as kind of cultural activists within their communities. And Highlands and Islands Enterprise has always had, for many years, a role in sustaining communities as well as in the high growth companies. So there's been a more close alignment between what Highlands and Islands Enterprise has been tasked to do and what cultural activists can bring to a community. So taking some of that practice and thinking about it in terms of the letters of direction to all the enterprise bodies that have now been set up and how they pursue their objectives, I think could be very interesting and exciting.
One of the suggestions that came to us from individual artists, which I have to say I was quite taken by, was the suggestion that a sectoral organisation or any organisation that got public funding through Creative Scotland would have to prove that they had put a certain proportion of that into supporting artists, so that it wasn't all going to managers or administrators or so on. How would you respond? As leaders of sectoral organisations yourself, how would you respond to that?
That's one of the things that, as Festivals Edinburgh, we try and do collectively across the 11 festivals that we represent, is through our impact studies, which focus on different types of impact every year: economic, social, cultural, environmental. We try and make sure that we can prove the impact that's happening for independent artists and arts organisations. So I mentioned the 10 Years of Expo Fund, which was showing that nearly 90% of that funding had flowed straight through to the commissioning and production of work for individual artists and arts organisations. We also did a study locally across Edinburgh of all of the non-Creative Scotland funded artists and art organisations that our festivals had worked with, and there were over 600 of them in the year that we studied, which was 2016. So I do think it's really important that artists understand the opportunities that are available to them and how the organisations that are commissioning them and working with them are leveraging the public funding that they get. So, you know, we are something like 27% publicly funded, and the remainder we're so I think that accountability is really important.
Yeah, and I think the opportunities as well, they have to be earning opportunities. You know, I spent quite a lot of time at the Edinburgh Festival at various different receptions, and I was talking to an artist who, there was a collaborative, the You Are Here project. It was you know, it was a way of bringing people together. But the artist that I spoke to said that they had been given lots of opportunities to meet other artists and make connections, and it was all terribly enjoyable. He didn't make one penny out of it. So I think we have to be careful when we're talking about giving people opportunities, that we're very clear that they give them opportunities to earn. Are you aware of that? You know, like sometimes things can be dressed up as a way of supporting artists, but they're not actually.
Well, there's different. I think there's different types of support for artists. So that's a professional development support for artists, and we know that our development programmes that enable artists from Scotland to meet artists, visiting artists who are coming to perform in the festivals, are extremely popular and oversubscribed, and are part of that pipeline. But it's a pipeline, and the ultimate goal, obviously, is that people have got to have livelihoods. So. But the way that feeds into the pipeline that does provide earning opportunities for them often is that these things work over a timescale of maybe 2 or 3 years. If people make a connection, let's use Canada as an example, because as I've mentioned, it's been very big for the last 3 years, and they've committed to invest in the future on continuing that. They brought over 50 presenters and promoters this year to connect with Scottish artists with the explicit purpose of looking for work to tour. So that might not happen tomorrow, and that might not happen next month, but you know, if we look 2 or 3 years down the road, a significant number of the people that we've been able to introduce to those counterparts will have got economic opportunity out of that. So it's about balancing up all of those different parts of the pipeline. Yeah,
okay. And just finally, again, to go back to some of the feedback that we got from the artists that gave evidence to us. When Donald Cameron was questioning you earlier, you had a conversation about the way that commercial sponsorship could affect the type of art that was performed. But what the artists told us is that all forms of funding, not just commercial sponsorship, can affect the type of art that's performed. And in some of the artists we spoke to were actually quite critical of the idea that they always had to prove that their art somehow improved some aspect of well-being, or, well, we all know that art is good for well-being, but they felt that some of the outcomes were particularly restrictive. The constant emphasis on innovation. We spoke to a jazz musician who was specialised in improvised jazz, for example, would argue that he was innovating every time his band performed, but to have to constantly change what you do, even if you're performing at a level of excellence, and even the pressure to collaborate. Collaboration is a good thing, but should artists always be pressurised to adapt their art in order to suit, you know, different funding models? So that was feedback that we got from quite a number of the artists that they spoke to here and out and about, and I wondered if you could respond to that. Do you think they've got a fair point?
I used to work at the Musicians Union, so I used to support around 2,000 freelance musicians. And obviously I know this kind of argument inside out because of that. And one of the things that supports artists to be able to experiment to make the work they want is having portfolio careers. So portfolio career, you would spend maybe a couple of days writing the music you want to write. At the weekend, you're in a wedding band that you do not like being in, but it's better that than working behind the bar, because at least you're still working as a musician. So you piece together this portfolio career that creates a little window for you to work on the stuff that you actually want to work on, that you can hope to maybe get commercial success from. If there isn't any work across the board, because there's nothing in education, nothing in health, no culture budget, there's nowhere to get any work, you get swept into different careers that you didn't want to be in because there's nowhere to do the cultural production. And again, the diversity, you can't be in that space unless you can afford it. So that's why sustaining opportunities to have portfolio careers on the ground and for culture to be across all areas of government is really important, because that's one of the ways that you sustain the experimentation on the ground, that experimentation time that people have. If you are asking anyone for money, there's always going to be their agenda, you know.
Just going back on that, you just made me remember that one of the artists we spoke to in Fife was, I believe he was a photographer, and he had a commercial practice as well as his more experimental artistic practice, and he was actually told that he should hide his website or for his commercial practice, and shouldn't try to distance himself from it, or maybe even close it down altogether, because he wouldn't get grants because he was doing that commercial practice. Is that typical?
This comes back down to the remit of Scottish Enterprise, Creative Industries Framework Agreement. Who's doing what? Who's responsible? Who's accountable?
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming today. And we've heard a lot of evidence that's given us a lot of food for thought. And we shall now go into private session. Thank you very much.